Jesus told us that in the end times, but before the Great Tribulation, a period of time that he termed the beginning of birth pangs would take place. Have they already begun? Well, some say yes, some say no. Let's see what the scriptures say. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All of these are the beginning of sorrows, or birth pains." So logically, if Jesus tells us they're birth pangs, there must be a birth. But who's born? The prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah both speak of this, so Jesus is referring back to that. Jeremiah speaks of a time of Jacob's trouble. Ask and see, can a man bear children? Then why do I see every strong man with his hands on his stomach like a woman in labor? See, that's the labor pains Jesus is talking about. Every face turned deadly pale. How awful that day will be. No other will be like it. It will be a time of trouble for Jacob, Jacob's trouble, but he will be saved out of it. In that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will break the yoke off their necks and will tear off their bonds. No longer will foreigners enslave them. Instead, they will serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. Sounds like he's going to resurrect David, and David will reign. That's interesting information also. So Jeremiah speaks of a national salvation after the time of Jacob's trouble that will be like labor pains. In Isaiah we read, as a pregnant woman about to give birth writhes and cries out in pain, so were we in your presence, O Lord. We were with child, we writhed in labor, but we gave birth to the wind. We have not brought salvation to the earth, and the people of the world have not come to life. But your dead will live, Lord, their bodies will rise. Let those who dwell in the dust wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. So Isaiah tells us the birth pangs lead to the resurrection upon the return of Messiah, that it's not something Israel does, it's something the Messiah does for them. So the birth is the resurrection of the righteous and the salvation of the nation of Israel. Both of these things happen upon the return of Jesus when he comes in great glory. Those labor pains are the Great Tribulation then. But before them, there will be more mild pains, what Jesus calls the beginning of the birth pangs. We call these type of contractions either false labor or Braxton Hicks contractions. They soften and thin the cervix to get ready for labor and birth. A woman may feel them in the weeks right before the due date. Jesus' analogy, therefore, explains that these events will occur in the years right before his return. A pregnancy is long, 9 months, but the Braxton Hicks contractions only occur in the weeks before delivery. In the same way, it has been 2,000 years since Jesus spoke these words, but the analogy tells us that only the last few years before Jesus' return will be considered the beginning of the birth pangs. This rules out a popular idea that the beginning of birth pangs has been ongoing for 2,000 years. It hasn't. Although these events, false messiahs, wars, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes are all like really common things, this means Jesus must have had specific versions of these things in mind. They can't be generic wars, earthquakes, etc., taking place all the time, but have to be specific things in order for Jesus to call them the beginning of birth pangs. Another important thing to consider is that Jesus was asked by his disciples what would be the sign of his coming in the end of the age. That makes these events, false messiahs, wars, etc., signs of that eventual coming. If they're signs, they must be recognizable. Otherwise, they aren't going to be signs. So we have established that they are specific events that will be recognizable from the milieu of events that have taken place over the last 2,000 years. That's important to know. Now, a large contingent of people believe the beginning of the birth pang events take place during the first half of the 70th week of Daniel, and that the Great Tribulation takes place in the second half. It is certain that the Great Tribulation takes place after the abomination of desolation at the midpoint of the 70th week. So the beginning of birth pangs period ends when the Great Tribulation, the severe labor, begins. But does this period, the beginning of birth pangs, start earlier than the 70th week? Could it begin 7 or 10 years earlier? Let's investigate that question. Jesus had this to say in the fig tree parable. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So a single generation will see all the things listed in the Olivet Discourse. That means that 70 or 80 years, which is the time of a generation, is the maximum time that these things could potentially take place. Of course, it could be a lot less, even just the first 3.5 years of the 70th week. So strictly from Matthew 24, we can't answer the question. Another question that people ask is, do these things happen at once, or do they take place one at a time? Are they sequential, one after another, until all of the events have taken place? Strictly from Matthew 24, we can't tell that either. However, we can make some assumptions. Braxton Hicks' birth pangs get more frequent the closer we get to full labor pains. And they also get more intense. If this pattern presents itself in the end times, and we can't be sure it does, but if it does, it would argue for all these events at least becoming additive to each other as time goes on. False messiahs begin the cycle, then war is added, then famine, pestilence, earthquake, etc., with worldly events becoming more and more intense as time goes on. Now, in this previous video, we discussed how the cycles of the new waves of coronavirus are occurring every 4 months, and this has been continued from the very beginning until December of this year. It's been a very consistent pattern, and how major national world events like the fall of Afghanistan, the death of George Floyd, the January 6th attack on the Capitol, etc., are all aligning with these spikes in coronavirus. Are these setting a pattern of pains, birth pains, that may eventually become the birth pangs? It's a curious idea, something we should all keep our eyes on. Another issue to consider, an extremely important issue, is that the beginning of birth pangs events found in Matthew 24 are directly parallel to the first 3 seals of Revelation. In fact, all of Matthew 24 is parallel to all of Revelation 6 through 8, verse 1. The 7 seals with 13 separate events occurring in exactly the same order. The odds of this being random chance, of course, is something like 6 trillion to 1. This is one of the most important end-time chronology issues in the Bible, that Matthew 24 is the same set of events as Revelation 6. This means that the false messiahs of Matthew 24 are the same as the first seal, the white horseman, and that the wars and rumors of war are the second seal, and that famine of Matthew 24 is the same group of events as the third seal. This is important because the first seal obviously comes before the second seal, and the second seal before the third. God placed those numbers on the seals to indicate chronology, and we need to know that they occur in order. This means that the coming of false messiahs and prophets is the first event in the beginning of the birth pangs. Let me say that again. This means that the coming of false messiahs and false prophets is the first event in the beginning of the birth pangs. For those who think that the first seal may have been the pandemic, that is impossible according to correct biblical interpretation. False messiahs come first. However, that doesn't mean that events aren't ramping up to have all these things kind of happen all of a sudden, maybe even one right after another. Let me explain what I mean. Pestilence is listed in the King James Version of the birth pangs in Matthew 24, and listed in all Bible translations at the fourth seal. But it is not the first event. Rather, it is a later event. But that doesn't mean that what is happening now isn't setting us up for an even more severe pandemic that will come later. The idea that pandemics may be ramping up to a more final fulfillment of the fourth seal is found in these words. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by wild beasts of the earth. So the beasts will be given authority to kill 1/4 of the earth's population by famine, sword, and pestilence. This seems to indicate a much more virulent pestilence than what we've been experiencing so far. 1/4 of the earth's population is more like 2 billion people rather than the 5 million who have been killed by COVID. The scale is completely different. It's like 1,000 times more. I want to bring up a common misconception about this pandemic issue as well. Many point to the crown worn by the white horseman and say, see, a crown, a corona. It's the virus. However, the Greek word in Revelation 6 for crown is Stephanos, a victor's crown, not corona. Corona is a Latin word for this type of crown. It doesn't seem to fit as a biblical interpretation. It would make much more sense if it is truly a godly symbol to tell us of what's happening. If it was a biblical idea, that the word would be Greek or even Hebrew, but not Latin. It seems like a coincidence to me, not a biblical interpretation. So the beginning of birth pangs will initiate when the first seal opens with the coming of false messiahs and false prophets. Has this happened yet? Not in our opinion. I think we are getting very close, but that time isn't here yet. In late November 2021, Prince Charles spoke of a humanistic false messiah who will correct climate change. The Iranians think the 12th Imam is already here, he just hasn't been revealed, and Jewish rabbis have claimed they have even spoken to their Jewish Messiah. So it is very imaginable that a number of these false messiahs could be revealed all within a very short period of time. Will this be a case of dueling messiahs? It well could be. If a Jewish Messiah is revealed, Islamic scriptures indicate that he will be killed by Isa, the Muslim Jesus. Also, imagine if a Sunni Muslim Messiah is revealed at about the same time as a Shia Muslim Messiah. These two groups, Shia and Sunni, are at odds with each other now. Imagine the conflict that will ensue if each group has their own Messiah. Their own Messiah, trying to prove the other one false. In fact, if you are a follower of this channel, you are aware that Daniel 8 is future prophecy and involves a struggle between the nation that occupies the territory of modern Iran, which Scripture calls the Ram, and a government occupying the territory around the Bosphorus Straits and the city of Istanbul, called the Goat, likely a Sunni Muslim caliphate. This passage says that the Sunni Goat is furious with the Shia Islamic Ram, and it attacks it. Why is it so angry with the nation who is likely Iran? Well, we aren't told. But one theory we have as a channel is in relation to a possible conflict between false messiahs, exactly the issue we're talking about. Sunnis versus Shia Mahdis. What would be the reaction of a Sunni Islam if a Shia false messiah were to surface in Iran? The Sunni would consider the Shia version of their messiah to be blasphemous. Obviously, they would believe that their messiah, the Mahdi, should be a Sunni, and they would love to prove this Shia Muslim Messiah to be false. This could be the event that instigates the prophesied attack by the Sunni goat against the Shia ram. It could be a religious conflict. And careful examination of Daniel 8 shows the Iranian ram has two leaders at the end, which it calls horns. The first being the supreme leader, or Ayatollah, who is currently in charge of Iran. But Daniel 8:3 tells us a second horn comes up and grows to be more powerful than the first. Who could this be? Who would come up during the end times and become more powerful than the current supreme leader of Iran? Our thought is that the second horn might be the 12th Imam or Mahdi or Shia Islamic Messiah. This isn't assured, but it makes a lot of sense and explains why the Sunnis would be so mad at Shia Iran, and also why the office of supreme leader would suddenly become subordinate to someone else who would assume ultimate power in Iran. So what do we think might bring about the beginning of the birth pangs? Our thoughts are the coming of any of these false messiahs we mentioned. And there sure are a bunch, at least 6, that the unsaved world is waiting for. But how soon might this passage in Daniel 8 take place? The one where the ram and the goat go to war? And you might have other questions about this passage as well, like, wasn't it fulfilled back in the days of Alexander the Great? Well, click right here for a complete explanation of these questions and how this passage will likely be fulfilled in the very near future. It might be the next prophecy to be fulfilled. Till then, till that video, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.